Adam Grant, organizational psychologist here at Wharton. Delighted to interview Malcolm Gladwell, my favorite author. Malcolm, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome to you. Yeah.
So let's start talking about your latest blockbuster, David and Goliath. Give us the core message and idea for you.
Well, it's just an examination of the idea of advantage, and particularly looking at when we see asymmetrical conflicts between one very large and one not so large party. How do we account for the unusual numbers of successes that underdogs have in those situations? And that the book takes off from there to try and figure out whether our assumptions about what makes for an advantage are accurate.
Could we just be wrong about who has the advantage in the first place? So we've labeled somebody an underdog, in fact they're not? Or is it more complicated than that?
Well, I mean, the opening story chapter in the book is about the actual retelling of the biblical story of David and Goliath. And there it's very clear, David is not in any sense the underdog. Properly understood, once he has decided to change the rules of the conflict, the sling in his hand is such a devastating weapon that no contemporary observer of that battle would have thought David was a long shot. They would have, once they realized he was winding up with his sling, they would have realized that he had all of the cards. So there is some of that we're misled by the narrowness of our assumptions about what constitutes an advantage in a given situation.
And that plays out in a wide range of circumstances in the book. So talk to us a little bit about desirable difficulties.
Yeah, so that's a notion taken straight from the psychological literature, from the work of the Bjorks at UCLA. And they were interested in that in the context of learning theory, about it is not always the case that if I make the task of learning something easier for you, that your performance will improve. There are sometimes cases where your performance will improve if I make the task of learning more difficult for you. Not always, but what they do is they draw a line between difficulties that are ultimately desirable and those that are not. And so I sort of play with that idea in a number of contexts and sort of figure out, are there cases when having dyslexia is a desirable difficulty? That's to say, where you end up being better off than you were before. And the answer is there is a small number of cases where it's plainly the case that, or at least according to those who have dyslexia and who have achieved enormous success, particularly entrepreneurs that's the group that's most interesting here. We see so many entrepreneurs who have dyslexia, and when you talk to them, they will tell you they succeeded not in spite of their disability, but because of it. And so for them, they view their disability as desirable, ultimately. And that's interesting. And that suggests that there are that the distribution of responses to an obstacle are profoundly bimodal. And I think we pretend they're not. Similarly, I look at this weird association between very successful people and having lost a parent, the fact of having lost a parent in childhood.
Not a desirable difficulty.
For some small number of people, parental loss appears to be ultimately a desirable difficulty. Again, not a large number, but it's sort of that there does seem to be a class of obstacles that for some people, for whatever reason, have an advantageous outcome.
Where do you draw the line? So what is it that differentiates people who end up on one side of the distribution versus those for whom the obstacle is just insurmountable?
I think you can't draw a bright line. It's not really a perfect, we can speculate. For example, if you look at the class of dyslexics who end up as successful entrepreneurs, they obviously have certain things in common. They tend to be highly intelligent. I interviewed maybe a dozen of them. And in every case, almost every case, the successful dyslexic had one family member who always believed in them. So maybe one way of saying is, okay, so if if your only obstacle is dyslexia, then it could be desirable. But if we say, so a child who grows up in a low-income neighborhood, who has an average IQ, who has a troubled family life, and has dyslexia, it's not going to be desirable. You've got too many obstacles to deal with. But if we start limiting the number of obstacles, then maybe it's different. So that's one idea, that perhaps it's just the kind of sheer. Another has to do with attitude. I mean, for whatever reason, some people choose to interpret their circumstances differently. There was when I was in one of the chapters, I would interview this. It's all about a famous oncologist named Emil Freireich, who has a Dickensian childhood, and then goes on to achieve enormous things as an oncologist. And there was a moment in my conversation with him when he describes this just horrendous childhood. And so he says, so there I am, I'm 16 years old, and I'm wildly optimistic. And you realize it was a complete non sequitur, but not for him. So he was just someone who, for whatever reason, he was orphaned, grew up in poverty on the streets, he was, the whole thing is just, but he was just like, he just thought that was an occasion to look on the bright side. So where does that come from? I have no idea.